So we will now have the next speaker, Dr. Walter Ladwig III, speaking to us on contemporary effectiveness of the BRI and GDI. So you will have 15 minutes.
Great. Thank you all very much. I've been asked to speak about the questions of the effectiveness of the Belt and Road Initiative and the GDI with particular reference to the context of East Africa and West Asia. And just to preview my remarks, it's certainly the case that the BRI has faced a slowdown in recent years, but I'm going to suggest today that there's evidence that the challenges and mistakes made in the first decade of the BRI have triggered a series of reforms and policy changes that could render a rebooted Belt and Road Initiative a much harder entity to compete with than BRI 1.0. So for an audience such as this, I don't need to really say all that much about the background of the Belt and Road Initiative, except to note that Xi Jinping's signature foreign policy initiative is seen in many circles as not just being about infrastructure, but about being a vehicle to spread China's political and economic influence around the globe. And it's certainly the case that countries of East Africa and West Asia have been beneficiaries of BRI financing, funding a range of large-scale port projects, railroads, highways, airports, and other projects in the region. So to date, it's estimated that China has deployed some $1 trillion via the BRI, only a fraction of it, I should note, in the form of grants. And as you can see from the charts, despite eye-watering outlays in the early period of the BRI, during the most recent half-decade, China's financial development outlays have declined significantly. So why might we see BRI activity slowing? There's a couple of factors that all interrelate. The combined challenges of a slowing global economy, rising interest rates, and higher inflation, which are compounded by the effects of the COVID pandemic and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, have raised concerns in China about the debt sustainability of numerous BRI partner countries. We've seen high-profile cases such as Sri Lanka and Zambia, which have struggled with their debt obligations. And China is now facing a significant repayment risk as the world's largest official debt collector. More than half of its official loans to low and middle income countries are now in their principal repayment periods, and it's expected that that figure will rise to 75% by 2030. The total outstanding debt estimated to be owed to China by the developing world from the BRI and prior lending is in the realm of $1.1 to $1.5 trillion. And I should point out that's just the principal, right? Then there's interest payments on top of that. And Beijing is trying to manage this role at a time in which many of its beneficiary borrower countries are financially distressed. So we're seeing overdue payments to China are on the increase. In terms of performance risk, China has witnessed an increase in infrastructure projects that face significant environmental, social, or governance risks, those ESG risks. So a 2021 study by Aid Data Laboratory at William & Mary University assessed that 35% of BRI infrastructure projects have encountered major implementation problems. So this is corruption scandals, labor violations, environmental hazards, public protests, and more than half of ongoing projects are assessed to be at risk of one or more of those factors. And we've seen that lead to examples of suspensions and cancellations of BRI projects. And we should also note that China is now trying to navigate the second decade of the BRI at a time in which its own economy is slowing down. And this slowdown in China's economy is structural, right? It's dating from the end of China's unprecedented economic credit and investment expansion. And the fact of the matter is, the factors that sustained China's growth for the decade after the 2008 financial crisis cannot be repeated in the next decade, particularly in terms of the property construction and local government. Factors manifest themselves in the specific context of East Africa and West Asia, where BRI recipient countries have found their projects marked by questions of debt, transparency, infringement on sovereignty, environmental impacts, and so forth. So as a result, I think we've seen the narrative on the Belt and Road Initiative shifting in recent years. Right? At one point, this was characterized as a major geostrategic play that leveraged China's significant foreign exchange reserves to win over foreign leaders by bankrolling large-scale infrastructure projects and funding lavish spending on vanity projects of dubious economic value. In the global battle for hearts and minds, it was said, Beijing and the BRI was winning. More recently, in light of the issues I've raised, there's been a new sort of counter-narrative that emerges that suggests perhaps the BRI is in stagnation, if not decline. Developing countries that have borrowed extensively from China are now saddled with debts for oversized infrastructure projects that generate insufficient revenue. The grace period on these loans has ended, which forces Beijing into the very unfamiliar position and comfortable role as the developing world's largest debt collector, which is at odds with the image that they're trying to portray as the global champion of South-South cooperation that privileges solidarity with low and middle income countries. In parts of the global south, we see politicians feeling compelled to either cancel or delay BRI-related projects because of rising levels of public dissatisfaction with China around the COVID pandemic and other factors, which are making it more difficult to have close relations with Beijing. And of course, we've seen international media outlets leap upon and set their sights on an array of aforementioned problems in the BRI project portfolio. So based on that, can we all relax about the Belt and Road Initiative and its apparent diminishing effectiveness? I suggest it would be unwise to do so because we are also seeing signs that China is rebooting its project of the century in ways that reduce risks and address issues with distressed borrowers, problematic projects, and areas of public opposition. And the net effect of this could be a better BRI that is much harder to compete with. So if we look at this over time, the BRI, we could see, has gone through 4 phases. So the early years saw significant investment in projects to connect China to its immediate neighbors. This then expanded beyond to encompass other parts of Africa, Europe, and even Latin America. We then saw the backlash over issues of debt, economic returns, questions of sustainability that put Beijing on the back foot, at least temporarily. But China is undertaking efforts to retool this initiative. Now, there are those observers who sort of scoff or downplay the idea of a BRI 2.0. However, analysis of project data indicates that Beijing appears to be recalibrating its approach, focusing on smaller projects and shifting course to offering debt-ridden countries emergency loans. This suggests a cautious but more strategic approach to the BRI and suggests a degree of change in the project's trajectory. So, acknowledging that a lot of its borrowers face challenges, Beijing has increased its emergency short-term lending to ensure that key participants have funds to meet their outstanding infrastructure project debts. And this carrot is being accompanied by sharply increased penalty interest rates for the late repayment of loans, as well as requirements of countries putting money in escrow accounts that can be unilaterally seized if debts are not repaid on time. In a really important strategic shift, China is now turning to Western commercial banks and multilateral institutions, which are renowned for their robust due diligence practices and risk management policies, rather than relying solely on its own policy banks to do the assessment of loan and project proposals. And a sizable portion of today's Chinese lending to low and middle income countries is being funneled through these Western commercial and multilateral development banks. So prominent names like Standard Chartered and BNP Paribas are now part of this process. Now, simultaneously, Beijing is reducing its own reliance on its state policy banks, Exim Bank, the China Development Bank, and instead boosting collaboration with state-owned commercial actors like the Bank of China and the China Construction Bank. We see them disengaging or slowing down the expansion of their aid and credit relationships with countries that are marked by high levels of environmental, social, and governance risks. And all of these together are designed to reduce the risk and address problems that affected BRI projects during the first 10 years. At the same time, I think we can also see evidence that China is injecting even more strategy into its BRI allocations. So today, 2/3 of the BRI recipient countries are those that are not overwhelmingly pro-China or pro-US. Effectively, Beijing is targeting what you might call the persuadable middle in international politics. Of course, it goes without saying that countries in which perceptions of Beijing have risen at Washington's expense are being doubled down upon. And this reformulation of the BRI is then paralleled and accompanied by the launch of the Global Development Initiative, which Xi Jinping undertook in September 2021. And I think the GDI can be seen as a complementary effort to the BRI, characterized by a focus on smaller, greener, and more sustainable development projects that align with global development goals. So, why, you're probably wondering, have I taken all of this time to go through these various details with you? And the reason is, I think it's because they have significant implications for efforts underway by various democratic states to compete with or offer alternatives to the Belt and Road Initiative. And I don't think all of these changes undergoing that have gone on in how China is approaching this have been fully appreciated. So as you well know, there have been a host of initiatives that have been described as potential alternatives to the BRI. First, we have the constantly rebranding multilateral effort that was once known as the Blue Dot Network, and then the Build Back Better World, and currently the Partnership for Global Infrastructure Investment, which circulates around the G7. This undertaking tries to meet infrastructure needs in the developing world while emphasizing transparency, sustainability, and high standards. The Quad has also gotten in on the infrastructure game and has set up bodies to coordinate its own efforts to meet regional infrastructure needs with much of the same focus as the PGII. And we also then have large-scale mega infrastructure projects. Japan has several unilateral initiatives. The India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, recently unveiled at the G20, is another. And what all of these efforts have in common is either an implicit or explicit premise that there is space to compete with the BRI on the grounds of quality and standards. In other words, things like transparency and accountability will be attractive if offered as an alternative to Beijing's approach. And there are certainly reasons to think that this is a viable strategy. Although it's sometimes presumed that Chinese financial resources are limitless, we can see that during the early BRI period, China and the G7 were effectively matching each other dollar for dollar. For every overseas development dollar that China was spending, the G7 countries together were spending about $1.10. In recent years, as the G7 has stepped up its spending, nearly $1.50 for overseas development dollars spent by China, and since 2021, the figure's been more like 2 to 1. And we see in particular the United States starting to close the gap on Chinese development spending. So individually, Beijing may remain and does remain the single largest source of international development finance in the world, but collective groupings like the G7, like the Quad, have the potential to match or come near its spending. Moreover, project data indicates that the BRI, that China tends to disengage from countries where large-scale buyer's remorse exists, rather than try and win over the population with further investment. So this potentially creates a window of opportunity for others to respond. Thus, there is room for optimism that multilateral entities, multilateral groupings like the Quad, like the G7 and others can address the fundamental unmet infrastructure needs of many developing countries. Now, the open question, however, is whether the various initiatives that have been put forth to challenge or provide an alternative to the BRI are calibrated to China's current approach, or whether they are a dated approach to what we might call BRI 1.0. In other words, sorry, let me see if I can get this, nope. As China has moved to enhance its levels of ESG safeguards and employ more sophisticated due diligence in its investments, is the promise of transparency, accountability, and quality going to be enough to present a credible alternative? It's certainly the case that developing countries want these things, but they also are highly focused on delivery. That is to say, they want infrastructure projects that can be delivered in a reasonable period of time without excessive delays. When it comes to project implementation, China still historically and contemporarily outcompetes G7 countries and multilateral development banks on both ease and convenience. As I've described, Chinese donors and lenders have begun to respond to rising levels of ESG risk by increasingly putting in place more stringent safeguards that may ultimately undermine efforts to outcompete Beijing on quality and safety. And very importantly, project data, again from researchers at William & Mary University in the United States, indicates that BRI projects that are subject to ESG safeguards do not face meaningful implementation delays, which suggests that Beijing may have a much stronger position in international infrastructure financing than many people appreciate. And of course, longer term, the challenge of competing and matching China's extensive foreign exchange reserves is significant. So to sum up, I think we may see the pendulum on the BRI swinging once again. At the start, the initiative was framed as a significant geopolitical challenge, and then as pushback mounted, it increasingly began to be discussed as perhaps a blunder or a burden for Beijing with the potential for blowback. As China moves to insulate this project from some of the challenges and mistakes that occurred during the first 10 years, we may see the emergence of a leaner, more strategic BRI that is much harder to compete with three key questions to ponder. First of all, does a BRI 2.0 that embraces ESG safeguards and standards represent the same level of geopolitical concern that the BRI did in its early days? Can countries and multilateral groupings that seek to compete with the BRI do so head-to-head in hard infrastructure, or is China's comparative advantage too great? And how will China's emerging position as the developing world's leading creditor influence the future direction of the BRI and its success? Thank you very much.